Are you ready for it?
Hello and welcome. My name is Carolyn Roberts, and I am the author of Tessa's Red Dress. And I am connecting with educators from all over on this podcast to talk about how we step into having difficult conversations in the classrooms with younger students or just in education in general. So we have some voices from all over to help you step into this work. So come join the conversation. Hello and welcome back. I am so happy to be here with my friend Shelly, whom I met last year, I want to say,
Yeah.
in Winnipeg. And I'm just so thankful that you decided to hop on with me and have a chat. So would you like to introduce yourself and help us locate who you are and where you are?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Carolyn. My name is Shelly Hopper, and I live and work on Treaty 1 territory in just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, although most of my work is in Winnipeg. I am a Red River Métis educator with Settler Roots. And so for the last 2 years, I've been engaged in anti-racism work, specifically working with 3 Metro school divisions in Manitoba. With the support of the Winnipeg Foundation as an anti-racism coordinator. So really working with school leaders and school leadership teams to develop anti-racism approaches, talking about how we support those students who have previously been on the outskirts or on the margins of our educational system and trying to support them through system change. And so I'm really grateful to be here. I've been in education for the last 25 years in public education as a teacher and administrator. So this is an important topic to me, just having finished my doctoral work in developing Indigenous leadership capacity. So happy to talk about the book.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. So yeah, we've had some conversations about how we step into this work and what does it look like. And I think that the hopes for the series of videos that I'm sharing on, it'll be on my website, is to really give teachers like a kind of a grounding foundation of what is it and how is it that they can bring in these topics and make sure that they're doing it, I think, with care and with authenticity. So, what are your thoughts?
That's great. And I think in a lot of the work, and I've had the privilege of working with so many educators and administrators over the last couple of years in so many different spaces, what I hear over and over again that people want to do this work. They really want to do the work. They're just a little bit hesitant on diving in there and feeling uncomfortable. And so we talk a lot about this in the work that I'm in, talking about the notion of safety versus discomfort and comfort, and really diving into the space of discomfort, because sometimes we're reticent maybe to engage in the work because we feel like it isn't really safe and we're really worried about the ramifications, but really defining how safety and comfort are two different things, and asking people when it's really not about safety, but it's more about comfort, how can we lean into the discomfort, recognizing that those individuals who are on the margins, who are from marginalized populations, feel discomfort on a regular basis. And so honoring that it isn't just people who are non-Indigenous or, non-racialized folks who are feeling this discomfort. We have feelings of discomfort from all different populations. And so leaning into that is important. The other thing, I think about when I look at this book is that notion of it really creates the tone for dialogue and creating a sense of humanity around individuals, specifically as it relates to Red Dress Day and murdering and missing Indigenous women, but really creating a space where we can recognize the gifts that they brought into those families as a maternal part of those families. And I think that's a lot of the work that we do, is diving into that dialogue where we're not just presenting facts to people, that we're talking about it in the idea of who are those people and the humanity that exists within them. And so when we think about that, we connect it often to the work of story and thinking about what are the stories that exist outside of the facts. And so sometimes in history, we share the facts of what happened, and facts can be a loose term as we talk about how things have been portrayed through history. But that notion of how do we actually build beyond that and understand the stories that are part of that, the people that were part of that, and engage in dialogue. Because sometimes we feel like that's the piece that's missing in anti-racism education, is the humanity and the notion of really understanding the ability to engage in dialogue. And I think Tess in the story does a great job of that, of even just asking these provocative questions. When mom is crying at the end when they're going to the march, and Tess says, why are you crying? I thought this was a happy day. Well, that's a provocative question, right? And a really complicated one that you can unpack in so many different levels depending on the age of students that you're working with, because it's more than just a fact-based answer, and it's complex. And mom has and does a beautiful job of explaining that in a really simplified way for in Tess, who's a younger child, and thinking about, yeah, it is about joy, but there's also some sadness in the things that she won't be able to bring into the table. And even in young students, as young as kindergarten, they have experiences with that sadness, and they can start to make connections. And I think this work of anti-racism and understanding Indigenous pedagogy and understanding murdered and missing Indigenous women from a very young age is about that empathy piece. And so young students can start to say, oh, I recognize that feeling a little bit, and maybe not to the same extent, but they can start to make connections to that. And I think that's how we grow stronger, if we start to understand one another's stories, and the empathy that can bring us together as opposed to dividing us, which has sometimes been what has happened.
Oh, that was beautiful. That was beautifully articulated. And yeah, and what I try to articulate, but you did it just so beautifully about, yeah, it's about bringing in those stories and connections, right? And I think with a lot of the conversations of why test came to be was because teachers were apprehensive and
Mhm.
worried, just like you said, right? And I love that complexities of, well, is it discomfort? Or, right? So, taking that pause point to look within to see what's going on for you. But a lot of the teachers that I was talking with, that they don't want to include the murdered part in murdered
Mhm.
or missing Indigenous women and girls. And I always tell them, who are we protecting if we're taking that piece out? So I'm wondering about the ways that, obviously, you must get very similar questions, and how do you navigate those conversations with folks?
And I think the piece that is important is relationality. And so this is why it's important that people who are familiar with those students are the ones doing that work, because it is about relationship. And so, in my role, we often get asked to come in and we say we're parachuting in to do the work of anti-racism. And so we talk with people about, how can we actually work alongside people to support you in this work, as opposed to being the one who is sending the message, because we don't have the same relationship with those students. And so we recognize it is the teachers, the educational assistants, the families who have these tight relationships with students. And so I think that's a really important part of this really complex work, because it is about relationality and it is about an ongoing piece. And I think we saw this when we started to bring in the conversations about Orange Shirt Day, and people were reluctant to be able to engage in the conversation about what that was really about with young students. And then we recognized, it's not that we are really dwelling on the part of all of those lives that were lost, but we need to acknowledge it. We're still just beginning to recognize and build a foundation for, and as students grow, about that foundation. But we also, then again, coming back to that notion of dialogue, have to create spaces for safe dialogue for students as well, to be able to ask questions, because it isn't just reading the story and now we're done. Just like we talked about, it's not just Orange Shirt Day and then we're done. How are these ongoing cycles of conversation and dialogue that come up, that we're bringing those things together? And the reality is, students right now are exposed to many, many things about what's going on in the world, both locally and globally. To assume that students have no understanding of what these concepts are is a little bit naive in this current world that we exist in and the things that they're exposed to. And so again, is that really about them, or is that our own discomfort about not knowing how to approach it? And so I think, you do a beautiful job in the book about just saying that those people who have had lives lost, or who are never returning, and we don't know, what has happened to them. And so there are ways that we can talk about that in developmentally appropriate ways, but it is still planting that notion that these things are real and they exist. And in Manitoba specifically, the Indigenous population is the largest growing group of people within our province, and they, account for about 18% of the population within Manitoba. So, and we know probably every Indigenous person has some connection to murdered and missing women and girls. And so those are realities. And so we're not escaping the conversation. We are just ignoring the fact that this is the reality for many, many of our students that exist within our classes. And that is the reality of that. So I think creating space where we're not just also dwelling on that is the only thing that Red Dress Day is about, because it's not, right? We want to honor that. We want to recognize the harms that have been done and hopefully create space of understanding and dialogue and empathy so those things don't continue to happen. But we also want to create space for understanding that those people whose lives have been lost, they were people with joy and family and traditions that they carried. And so we want to create that as well. So it's not just about the fact that they are murdered and missing, but also that they carried this strong piece of family with them, no matter who they were.
Hmm. Yeah, and that was a big thread that I wanted to make sure that I was putting that continual thread that I was putting through the book is
Mm-hmm.
that Auntie's an important person in this family, and now that she's not there, what does the family look like, and what happens when we're missing a core person in that, and it affects everybody, and it's not just like a singular unit. It has ripple effects beyond that. So I think that that's a really important piece. And when we think about families and family unit, which is what we have to talk about, I don't know if it's similar in Manitoba, but here in British Columbia, when they come into kindergarten, it's about family and
Mm-hmm.
that, and then it goes to community, and they build like that. So we're doing just the same thing with Indigenous communities of what does that look like? This is what family looks like in Indigenous communities. And in our communities, matriarchs are the strong through line of our communities. So who are they? What does that look like? And then by the time when they start to teach about Red Dress Day and murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in grade 4, about what it actually means, is that they come in with this foundation of understanding matriarchs and the matriarchal system is the hopes, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we just need more authors to be able to create stories and picture books and things so that people can understand that. And I think that, I feel like it's kind of like the next wave. The first wave was Orange Shirt Day, and now let's talk more about, and it's really about the systemic racism in Canada. So in the back of the book, I did like a condensed version of chapter 4 of the report because there's so much to unpack. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it has a lot to do with educating the teachers and setting the foundation within the work that we do.
I agree. And when you think about it from an anti-racism lens, as far as breaking down the system, it is creating space for empathy that hasn't existed within the curriculum prior to that. And so I think just that is a foundational way of looking at things in a different way when we're allowing in that emotion. And the other piece, when you talk about, um, in the book, you talk about, the Kookums and the grannies and things being in the kitchen and the aunties and talking about how previously they weren't able to have these celebrations. Even for me, there was a moment of, that's really a celebration because, I think about it used to be the grannies who didn't get to engage in those celebrations at all. And now your booking is bringing in, we're actually starting to make this shift where it's the grannies who are now in the kitchen talking about previously they hadn't been able to celebrate those things. So now we even think generationally how that's starting to shift, right? We have more people who have been having those experiences of that as well. And then when I connected to that, the colonization of how curriculum looks in our Western school system still and ongoing. But when I think about the matriarchal system and the role that matriarchs have in that, and the majority of early years teachers being women, and so what role do they play as women, as matriarchs, in being able to pass along this history in a different way, whether they're settlers or whether they're Indigenous folks, but saying my place in this is actually to be a matriarch within this societal kind of expectation of Western education, to say I'm a matriarch in this and this is my responsibility now to pass this along in a different way. And so I think that kind of resonated with me as well, and that whole notion of being in the kitchen, but also now this matriarch running this early years classroom and thinking, I'm the person now. It's my responsibility to pass this along as we think about disrupting systems that have existed that kind of blocked out all of the personal attributes that people carried into the classroom, and now saying, actually, let's talk about those. And we want to lay a framework so that then as you say, when you get to grade 6, they're not saying, what? I had no idea that any of this existed. Like, why didn't someone talk to me about this? And I think sometimes we don't give our young folks enough credit that they're able to manage and ask really great questions and engage in dialogue at a really young age. And in fact, some of those kids have less of that embedded into them in those early years, where they're willing to ask the questions that come to mind and not worry about being judged about those questions, than they do even later in elementary and into high school.
100%, right? Yeah. I
Yeah.
personally love the questions, but that's why I'm an elementary school teacher. So I think that you've probably said all of the things that you would say, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because I like to ask it. If you had a whole group of early, like primary educators sitting in front of you, what would be your advice to them about how they could step into the work?
I think just take the step is the biggest advice that I make to people. You're never going to feel completely ready. You're never going to know all of the information, but take a step into the work and do the work yourself. And I think about what you know, what you don't know, and take the time to explore those things. So you can anticipate the questions that students are going to bring up. There's a lot of really great information in the teacher's resources at the back. So making sure to read that ahead of time if you don't have that foundational knowledge, and be willing to say, I'm just not sure. Because the reality is we don't have all of the information, and we're never going to be equipped to manage every question that comes up. And I think that's the bravery in this work, right? Being able to be uncomfortable, knowing that you may get asked questions by families or students or other educators in the building. But I think when you really take the time to dig into your own understanding and your own why about this work and why it is important, then it's a lot easier to engage in those conversations if you feel confident about that.
Mhm. Oh, that's beautiful. What a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you
Mm,
for having me. It's always
Thank
a pleasure.
you. Thank you. And of course, so I'll follow up with an email to you so I can get your address so that I can send you a copy of test once I get my hands on it. Hopefully soon. So that I can share that with you so you can share it beyond in your places and spaces. So thank you so much for joining the conversation today, Shelly.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful resource, and I think it's a gap that we have in really addressing these issues for young students. And even the pictures that go along with it. There's so many other stories to unpack within that, other than just murdered and missing women and Indigenous girls in that book, if you want to dig even deeper. So I think it can be used for lots of different conversations.
100%. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining our conversation today with Shelly. What a beautiful conversation and some really great ideas for you to step into this work. Please check out our website at carolynroberts.net to watch all of the videos in this series. If you want to join the conversation, take a look at the website and fill out the form, and maybe we can have a conversation too about what you do in the classroom for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again.
Are you ready for it?